It's good to be here. We have really a great two speakers today. We have both a speaker and a respondent. So the main speaker will be Rabbi Fred Scherlinder Dobb. He actually started it at Adat Shalom when he was only 8 years old, and he grew and grew and went to seminary and came back, or rabbinic school, I guess. And upon his ordination, he actually came back to being full-time rabbi and has served there ever since. So a very unique situation. He's done many community highlights, which include working with the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington for 7 years now, hosting a dynamic pluralistic young Israeli group, spearheading recent long-range planning processes, and crafting thoughtful and allusive mission statements, and many other such activities. His leadership goes well beyond the community he serves. He serves as chair of the National Coalition on the Environment and Jewish Life, and is on the boards of both the National Religious Partnership for the Environment and Interfaith Power and Light, also called the Regeneration Project. He's been deeply engaged in social and racial justice issues, including Jews United for Justice, multi-faith. He was a past board member of the Interfaith Conference of Metropolitan Washington, and he's done much work with Israeli progressive efforts, including J Street and more. So today he's going to talk to us, as Maynard said, about whose earth is it anyway in the beginning. Rabbi Fred, take it from here.
Delighted and honored, and thank you all. That's a slightly old bio, but that's fine. We all evolve. I am so thrilled to be with you all. I will be spinning through, as the program suggested, with a first half on what, or why, perhaps, and a second that might be some insight into how. And before I forget, I saw in the lead up that on November 13th, the next IRAS program, I may ask someone to put it in the chat, the actual title, because it overlaps very much with the second half of where I'm going, which is kind of how religion can be an asset in goading and guiding us toward the work that we need to do in our right relationship with Earth and with its fellow inhabitants. So that's a little bit of where we're going. I very much look forward to your questions, and I've already invited Gail to interrupt me at any point as some good ones come, or if there's more wisdom around the room, as I expect there will be sooner or later, than that which is coming from the presentation. So thrilled to be with you. I'll note later, you'll see the shifting light of a very warm, abnormally so, late afternoon in Washington, D.C., and I am in the temporary booth or hut, the sukkah, that is traditional at this time of year. You're supposed to live in it and work in it, and we're winding down the holiday of Tabernacles, Sukkot. So just so you have a little context for the otherwise odd backdrop. More on that in a little bit. So unless Gail or Maynard or anyone has more, we're gonna jump in. Yes.
Great.
Okay. So just a moment while I clean up the presentation here and get it in slideshow format from the beginning. Here we go. All right. So thrilled to be again with you. I represent COJL, as it says, Coalition on the Environment and Jewish Life, which is one of many organizations. We'll get a quick sense of some of the NGO landscape in a little bit. But this is one of countless ways to address the question of what wisdom do our ancient, venerable, sacred traditions have that we need to highlight for their own adherents and at the same time share with one another. And I deeply believe, apropos of this opening slide from the fabulous late feminist artist Judy Chicago, this vision, Rainbow Shabbat, of people of all races and faiths gathering together and enjoying each other's holy time. This is the model. We need to be learning from and celebrating with each other. And in that spirit, I love that the Institute for Religion and Science, right? It's not just the Institute for Protestant Christianity or the Institute for Islam or the Institute for Baha'i, right? It's all of the above and more, and that is a truly beautiful thing. So here are drawn from Jewish tradition with tremendous overlap from certainly other Western scriptural traditions, Christianity chief among them, but I think you'll find many parallels as well, and with Eastern and indigenous traditions, certainly with Islam. And as you see some of those comparisons and contrasts, those would be great things to add to the Q&A that Gail will raise over the course of a conversation. So why do we need to prioritize climate justice? And I will say even the frame of climate justice is a bit reductionist. I had the honor of learning recently with Dr. Catherine Richardson, leading EU, originally American, but EU scientist with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who noted that the climate has always changed just over millions of years, and Earth will be here no matter what we do. The biodiversity crisis that we are driving through our short-sighted action is at least as great as the climate crisis. And I think it's important to keep that in mind as we proceed as well. But why are we prioritizing all of this work? And certainly in late October of a presidential election year, it looms large to say that when we say prioritize, that means that we also perhaps direct the lion's share of our energy and our resources, and certainly our one vote each, in the direction of those who will uphold these values. Not going to be partisan about that, but whichever party, whatever party you are with, and whichever candidates you are inclined to support, make sure that you are public in naming these as central concerns. And we actually need people across the political spectrum to do exactly that. So very quickly, top 10, ready? I wish we had the, the drum roll kind of thing. So the very first reason, of course, is universal. This would apply to any tradition, however insular we may be, however focused we are on our co-religionists. We need to remember that we are part of something greater. It's not accidental that the Torah, the Bible, has its opening 11 chapters as a universal tale before it zooms in on one family and one particular faith heritage. So we go back to common ancestors, a beautiful, roughly 8th century midrash, that when creation was unfolding, God led the primordial human, Adam, around all the trees of the garden and said to this primordial human, who, by the way, is androgynous, so I'm not saying he, because woman was not in any way an afterthought, but very much a co-equal. God said to this primordial human, look, ain't it great? Isn't it awesome? Enjoy it, but take care, lest you spoil and destroy my world. She'im kalkalta, if you curse it, if you degrade my creation, ein mi sheyitaken acharecha, no one's going to come after you to fix it. And so it's on us. There is no planet B, as people at the protests that I often attend love to note. You'll see the backdrop here, of course, the famous Christmas Eve 1968 photo of Earthrise from Apollo 8 that sort of burst our consciousness open of this fragile pale blue dot that we inhabit. And on the bottom, the lines from Genesis chapter 2, verse 15, a necessary corrective to the idea of dominion that we so often hear as isn't Western tradition all about humans dominating, right? Well, actually, the first humans are told in the first ecosystem to do two things: le'ovda, to serve the land, to work it, to serve it, ulashomra, and to guard it. That's Genesis chapter 2, verse 15. The only scriptural option that is not on the table is to let it get worse on our watch. And of course, we can't just say there is no plan B and move on. We need to channel, as Dr. King so importantly taught, the fierce urgency of now. We're going to revisit that theme a little bit later, but this idea of building the beloved community needs to be both in the human sphere and also beyond. He was a liberation theologian, and liberation theology through the 60s was necessary and vital. And by the 70s, you begin to hear voices, Sally McFaig and others, beginning to turn it into an ecological direction as well. And I would assert that liberation theology needs to consider the beloved community as the biotic community as well as the human family. Okay, that's number one. Number two, whose earth is it anyway? Should have some kind of a game show format for this. So the obvious answer from the scriptural tradition is it's God's. And that is actually a pretty radical idea. No matter what each of our conceptions of the Holy One may be, there's something really powerful here when God says in Leviticus 25, this is introducing the ideas of the 7-year soft reset and the 50-year hard reset, key sustainability teachings, that you can't sell the land beyond undoing anything that a deed transfer does, because Kili haaretz, the land is mine. Gerim v'toshavim atem imadi. By me, you are simply strangers and sojourners. You humans who think you own the land, no, you are temporary. I am the deed holder, and you can't mess up the land beyond reclaim. We think about mountaintop removal mining. We think about the amount of plastic or strontium-90 from our atmospheric nuclear testing, et cetera, that is now in the breast milk of polar bears and Inuit humans and others in ecosystems thousands of miles away. We have not been following this dictum, and we need it. In particular, we're going to zero in on this later, we need humility, because that's the ultimate direction of this teaching. Psalm 24, the core of liberation theology, as taught by initially our Catholic cousins in Central and Latin America, del Señor es la tierra. If the earth is God's, then it doesn't actually belong to the junta. It doesn't belong to the representatives of the northern interests that are doing these horrible things in their backyard. Actually, the earth is God's, and therefore it needs to be divided somehow equitably among all of God's children. And that is a pretty radical reworking of the world that we live in. Religion at its root is radical in the sense of root, getting down to the core. This is not a political statement, but it's a reminder that if we are called to faithfulness, we are going to be called in some pretty profound directions that are at times remarkably countercultural. This is certainly one of them. Number three, justice and equality. I say that perhaps this should be number one, because love thy neighbor as thyself is about as core as it gets. And in our tradition, we match that from Deuteronomy 16, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice you shall pursue, doubled, in case you missed it the first time. So what are the implications of this? And later in Leviticus 19, where it says, love your neighbor as yourself, it also says, don't stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. while your neighbor's blood is being spilt, and we live in a global village today, what does it mean to stand idly by? And so I submit the image here of various folks from the global south noting at a previous COP gathering, climate change affects us the most. We must not stand idly by. There are human implications for this, including that we need to empower the historically disempowered. We need to enfranchise the historically disenfranchised, and we need to do our best at the restitution and reparation where there has been brokenness in the human as well as the biotic community. And so love thy neighbor and Black Lives Matter kind of go together. And we could do the same with any of a number of groups that sadly have not been centered in the discourse that has gotten us here, but need to be centered in the solutions as we move forward. And I love this. Our friends at Friends Committee on National Legislation at every protest here in DC have this sign, love thy neighbor, no exceptions. And we need to keep that very much in mind. I come back to the image from Judy Chicago of this rainbow Shabbat. Everyone looks different, and yet each of us is an image of the divine. That's the power of the foundational myth of Genesis chapter 1, in which we are all created in the divine image, no exceptions, and therefore love your neighbor, no exceptions. Moving a little more quickly, number 4, we have an entire law in Judaism called Bal Tashchit, do not waste, thou shalt not waste, as it were, comes from the bizarre situation of a siege in war against a city. You're not allowed to cut down the enemy's trees, even though doing so would give a military advantage, maybe save lives on your side, end the conflict sooner, and yet the trees are non-combatants, and the trees need to be there generation to generation, irrespective of what language or culture is dominant in inside that city. So early text takes this idea and extends it all the way to energy conservation. This is in the Talmud by the 4th century about oil lamp versus naphtha lamp. You need to know what you're burning and use the best available technology, or you violate traditional Jewish law. Love that. Think about what we know today. What would it look like to say we are violating religious norms? We are violating ethical laws whenever we make a choice that is not best in class, whether it's the purchase of a new vehicle or a decision of how we're going to get there, or where we set the thermostat, or again, who we vote for, where we put our energy, those additional places to move the needle. Beautiful 13th century text. I love the parallel. This is mustard seed. Remember Jesus's teaching, of course, the parable of the mustard seed. It's kind of antiquity's classic notion for the smallest thing that they could grok. We now understand, to the extent they're understandable, quarks and subatomic particles and proton, neutron, electron. But mustard seed is their image for that. Righteous people don't waste even a mustard seed. This is the yardstick of righteousness. Really righteous people are sad whenever they see any wasteful, destructive act. They use all their strength to save anything possible from destruction. The wicked, however, are effectively rejoicing in the destruction of the world as they are spiritually, morally destroying themselves. Again, 13th century German Jewish pietistic text, incredibly powerful stuff. Judaism, I would say most of this presentation could be given with slightly different texts from a Christian or Muslim or other standpoint. There's a few places where perhaps Jewish tradition has a unique contribution to make, and one of them is here. We are in an anti-regulatory moment when one political party says regulations are bad, all regulations, and the other is trying to defend a handful of them. But actually, the Talmudic model is regulation is holy. Regulation is how you actually get norms to apply so that values hold fast in the public sphere. It is this unique Jewish contribution to this larger climate conversation in which the public good routinely outweighs the private good. There's absolutely concern for the individual and absolutely a certain amount of property rights, etc. But this idea of it's mine, you can't touch it, is completely distant from classical Jewish thought. Here's the 16th century normative law in the Shulchan Aruch. You may do something at a distance and it causes damage. Think about emissions in this light, right? But whoever has done that deed is liable for whatever damage is done, however far away. That's pretty wild. So we're halfway through the top 10. Reminder of the core teaching here. We are all in this together. So at this halfway point that remember the climate and environmental crises of our moment, the poly crisis, is timely and urgent. That's the universal concern. There's the theological notion that none of it is ours to begin with, it's God's. There's the centering of the least among us, justice and equity as a concern. There's conservation straight up, thou shalt not waste. And there's regulation that we need to be ready to embrace that. Here's the back five. Preserving life. One may not gain a livelihood at the expense of another's health. Just think about how many categories of jobs today would be eliminated if this 14th century piece of Jewish text were actually being held onto. We also have this idea of pikuach nefesh, of saving a life, and that outweighs all other possible considerations. And when we think about the many ways in which the uncontrolled science experiment we are conducting with the only atmosphere, the only global climate that we have, and the many ways that could go awry, and the many ways that imperils human life and human flourishing, these texts and that notion of choosing life, as Deuteronomy 30 famously says, need to be centered. Rainbow Shabbat again, because Shabbat is another one of these uniquely Jewish teachings that reminds us the greatest time that we spend is not in the realms of production and consumption. It's precisely when we step out of the rat race. It's Sabbath as a time of being rather than doing or making. And we need that. We need to hold on to that idea that the best thing possible does not come at yet another marginal environmental cost. The best thing possible is when we gather with each other, when we build community, the bonds of love and art and friendship and connection, community, all of which come at zero carbon, but are sustaining us in a very deep way. So the larger conversation of sustainability is not just the carbon footprint, it's also what sustains us. As Abraham Joshua Heschel, famous mid-20th century rabbi, described the Sabbath as a time of cooperation with the forces of nature and a time of armistice in our struggles with our fellows. And he says, ending rhetorically, is there any institution that holds a greater hope for human progress than the Sabbath? We actually progress by taking a break. We move forward by making the growth that we do sustainable. That applies, sorry, here on the right-hand side, you see the idea of shmita. I think in the bio that was circulated, it said, my goal is to make this an English word. Shmita is radical release. It's a teaching that comes up 4 different times in the Torah, which is a lot. And it says in the 7th year, you take a break. You basically apply this Sabbath logic of 1 day in 7 also to years. 1 day in 7 is radical in its own way, but you can miss 24 hours and you're back in the rat race. A year of stepping out of production and consumption, and in this case of large-scale agriculture. If you knew that happened every 7 years, your society would be a lot more resilient. Your scales would be smaller. You would know your neighbors. You would be cross-trained for a bunch of things. And the entire enterprise, social, economic, political, cultural, would be sustainable in a very different way. It was never practiced exactly as described, but we hold up the shmita, radical release, or sabbatical notion as kind of an asymptote, that we need to make sure that the work that we do approaches it, even if we never quite get there. Biodiversity, endangered species. As I said before, this is in some ways the great crisis of our time that we are engendering on others. Our classic texts remind us, even the things you don't like, the things that bug you or bite you or are even dangerous to you, they are still part of Seder Bereshit, the scheme of creation. God created these things for a reason. God said it's good for a reason. And we shouldn't be second guessing. And so we need to work and be the Noahs of today, right? Noah being the first endangered species activist, and the story in Genesis 6-9 being the first iteration of the Endangered Species Act, which comes up for reauthorization every so often. It needs to be strong. Again, we need regulations. Don't think that everything else exists for our sake. Our greatest medieval philosopher Maimonides wrote here on the bottom. Rather, all the other beings too have been intended for their own sakes. This is not just about us. This is an early poster from our group, COJL, Coalition on the Environment and Jewish Life. Millions of species are in danger of becoming extinct in the near future. Noah was, and this is quoting chapter 6, verse 9 of Genesis, a righteous person in his generation. Shouldn't we be righteous people in ours? Home stretch, literally home, because when you build a new house, a home, we are told in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 8, you must make a parapet for your roof, lest you bring blood guilt on your house should anyone fall from it. Do the simple action, though it costs a little extra, though it's an annoying regulation that could be seen as negative from a market forces standpoint, but the reality is sooner or later someone's going to be on your roof. And this could be the life and death difference. Don't argue. Don't obfuscate. Don't say only a roof of less than 30-degree pitch where people are likely to be on it. And certainly don't say only a roof in a neighborhood where at least 3 children have already fallen off of a roof, establishing an empirical trend line that can't be obfuscated by industry-funded science. It says build the damn parapet. This is the precautionary principle. First, do no harm. And it is right here in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 8. Again, think about the uncontrolled science experiment of modernity with our one biosphere. Where are we in that process? Love this from Tom Tolles, the recent Washington Post cartoonist, with Uncle Sam looking, and we don't quite know where we are between it's still too soon to take the dramatic action that we need and it's too late, but we know it's coming. And so this is ethics, this is conscience, it is also spirituality, it is scripture, it is science, it is religion. And so I'm honored to be presenting this in the context of IRAS. Finally, Ledor Vador, you hear that all the time in Hebrew, from generation to generation. And the classic text from Deuteronomy 30 alluded to earlier, Uvacharta b'chaim. God says, I'm giving you free will. I'm giving you life and death. I'm giving you blessing and curse. The choice is yours. Now, choose rightly, choose sustainably, choose the path that affirms life for you and your descendants, because the choices you make have life and death implications for those who come after you. I would personally say this is not a text about when life starts. We're not talking about unborn here. We're talking about the unborn in the sense of, I don't have grandkids yet, but should I be blessed to someday have them, I want them to grow up in a world in which my choices didn't delimit theirs. And the sad reality of my share in global climate emissions is such that I'm not yet living as I should be. And I would suggest very few of us, in fact, are. So there you go. These were our 10. We're all in this together. As promised, a quick sense of some of the groups. There's one wonderful organization, Interfaith Power and Light. I serve on their national board. This is the image from the local IPL DMV. For those of you who live in the District, Maryland, Virginia area, ipldmv.org. Fabulous group. I happen to have just connected in Hawaii, and I was talking earlier with our respondent, Jane, about the ways that different traditions say the same thing in different language, and particularly the power of indigenous traditions. So it's worth sharing, as I shared at a UCC church in Honolulu just last week, summarizing this, that traditional Hawaiian concepts of malama, this mutual caring for each other and for future generations and having reverence for all life, and kuleana, responsibility. You've heard that word before, you'll see it again. We are all teaching the same things, even from places that in antiquity had nothing to do with each other, different sources of inspiration, different scriptures, different creation myths, and yet we are all in this together. So many states doing this incredible work of Interfaith Power and Light. Other groups under the umbrella of the National Religious Partnership for the Environment, Creation Justice Ministries doing amazing work across the Protestant world, together with the Evangelical Environmental Network, Catholic Climate Covenant, and our group Kojal. Lots of others. There's Green Faith doing this good work. Here's a bunch of Jewish leaders getting arrested at Faith versus Fossil Fuels that they organized. Here's some of the other incredible resources. I'm sure some of the people from these orgs have been on previous IRASs or will be soon. So many important groups, this just in the Jewish world. Worth noting, Dayenu is the big climate action organization that's fairly young, older. Here in the middle, the Shalom Center, founded by Rabbi Arthur Waskow, who began teaching this stuff in 1968. His retirement party is tonight. So special shout out to Rabbi Arthur. Summarizing this, we're all in this together. That applies for any one group like Jews. It applies to the larger group of people of faith, the yet larger of all of humanity, the human family, and beyond that, the biotic community, all of creation. So that was part one, and that's almost all the time we have. I still have a few for part two. We're going to get there in just a moment. The question that part two asks is, if we know better, if we already have all of this behind us, why aren't we routinely choosing better? But I was able to find and pop in very quickly. This is leaders of all those groups that I just mentioned: Interfaith Power and Light, Catholic Climate Covenant, Evangelical, etc. I'm back here somewhere. This was today at the State Department, giving the whole faith activist community gathering with representatives from the U.S. delegation to COP29 as they prepare to leave for Azerbaijan, for Baku, where the 29th Conference of Parties to the UN Climate Convention framework will be unfolding, and praying for them to take these teachings and the ethics and the spirituality as absolutely far as they can within the realpolitik and give and take of international climate negotiations. This is the work that we're doing. This is the key application that it has. And I'm going to actually stop the share for a moment here. And if any of the organizers want to pop on, feel free. But while we're in this sort of break moment before a quick exploration of the how, this is a lulav. It is myrtle, willow, and palm, together with the fruit of the goodly tree. This is from Leviticus 23. It says for this week, you take the fruit of a goodly tree, which later tradition says is an etrog or citron, and you shake it in your sukkah for at least 7 days in the fall to remember the vulnerability and the interdependence of all. And again, by spending so much time in this fragile, temporary thing that doesn't even have a proper roof, if it rains, you get wet, which is also to say, if it's acid rain, then your skin suffers. Whatever's outside, you breathe, which of course we all do, even with filters in our homes or cars. But here, if there's too much smoke from wildfires, you're breathing the PM 2.5. If there's too much mercury from power plant emissions and coal burning, along with all the horrible byproducts, we're all on the hook for it. So something really powerful about this moment of Sukkot or tabernacles and all this symbolism of the plants that thrive in different bioregions, different amounts of water, all interdependent with one another, again, in the biotic community and in the human community. So any input from anyone before like 10 more minutes on the Musar stuff?
Keep going. You're doing great.
Okay, hope so. Excellent. All right. So back to our regularly scheduled PowerPoint. So today literally is Hoshana Rabbah. It is Rav is great, and Hoshana is the original word that became Hosanna. This is the great Hosanna, the great crying out of save us, please. And that is the 7th day, which is beginning with sunset, and then the actual celebration of Shmini Atzeret, the 8th day, and the holiday at the end of this whole crazy month is around the corner tomorrow night. Again, the key question, if we know better, why aren't we doing better? And Judaism, like so many other traditions, has amazing prescriptions for how to work on our ethics in advance, so that when we are presented with a choice, we are likelier to make the right choice. Some of the midot or attributes that we need to be developing inside ourselves. This is a chant that I like to begin this with. These 4, 2 synonyms for love and loving kindness, along with mercy and peace. What does it mean to deepen our own proclivity in these directions and to literally practice mercy, practice peace, practice love? Ahava v'rachamim chesed v'shalom. And of course, you can fill out others like that. In the 19th century, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter founded the modern, what's called the Musar movement, which focuses on these attributes. You see the wheel on the left with things like equanimity, patience, order, decisiveness, cleanliness. These are the original 13. And where did the number 13 come from? Well, it actually came from Exodus chapter 34, because we're told that God has 13 attributes, and we sing those often. But Ben Franklin, of all people, picked up on this, and in his autobiography, some of you have seen this, he has a little appendix with a grid where he says, take 13 attributes like equanimity and patience and order and decisiveness and frugality, and focus on them for like a week at a time and do this once a quarter and keep going and practice virtue ethics. It's now become a whole subfield within ethics, which is a subdivision of philosophy. There's a further subdivision, virtue ethics. Focus on developing your virtuousness. So it's not just about making the right choice, it's about being the kind of person who routinely, automatically makes the right choice. Ben Franklin's notion of 13 got translated into Hebrew, literally, and applied Jewish sacred text around it, and it's now a whole thing with the Orthodox practitioners having no idea of the Ben Franklin beginnings. That's fine. Good ideas are meant to be shared. This is certainly one of them. Musar has many, many definitions: moral conduct, instruction, discipline. I love this teaching that it's ultimately helping the heart to know what the mind already understands. It's really about shrinking the gap between the intellect and the choice, or between the id and the superego. Lots of ways to talk about this. This comes from a Baha'i inflected, the Virtues Project, similar listings, lots of ways of categorizing them, like a periodic table, etc. Each one of these are different ways of approaching these so-called midot, or attributes. If we had longer, I'd focus on some of these things. We're going to skip them now, but I just want to point out Homer Simpson here. Look very closely at the poor guy racked by indecision. Which voice does he listen to? And sometimes we feel like it's this way. Notice carefully, both the devil and the angel are Homer. Right? This is id, superego, etc., all playing itself out, and we are continually on the horns of these dilemmas. We're inclined with our physical or lower or unrefined selves to go in directions that are self-oriented, that will please us in a short-term way, but will not advance our long-term values or relationships. And then we have our better angels, the better angels of our nature, etc., as Lincoln famously said in his second inaugural. And that's the higher self, or the still small voice within, the voice of conscience. We have that too. We need to figure out how to routinely let the angelic voices be louder than the self-interested ones, so that we make the right choices. This is the world of Musar. And I wanted to end with just a quick example of how this plays out, and an invitation for each of us to begin to develop our own virtue ethics around sustainability, around justice, around what it means to live in the time of polycrisis, with that consciousness, with all the scientific understanding we have of how little time we have before the ill effects mount. I'm not spending time on the science. I think you all know this, but it's dire, and it's coming into clearer and clearer focus, and it's looking worse and worse. We know this, but with that knowledge, what choices are we making? So truth, the Hebrew word for truth, emet, comes from the beginning, the middle, and the end of the Hebrew alphabet, literally the first letter, the 14th, and the very, very end. In other words, the whole truth. We need to look at all of it, even the parts that are inconvenient, ergo an inconvenient truth. And I also love the expression that's been popular in recent years: science isn't really truth, it's the process of finding the truth, and science doesn't change its opinion, it's not lying, it just learns more. And that should be a very religious notion, to be looking to learn as much as possible and to make sure that we are living in light of the larger reality. Chesed, loving kindness, an orientation that focuses on enlivening the spirit of the downtrodden and the brokenhearted, again, centering the least among us, particularly in this global village. Chesed, loving kindness, as we saw how that applies. Frugality, simplicity, learning to get by with less, to appreciate the little things, a stance of gratitude and appreciation that it then allows us to have fewer cubic feet that we need to heat or air condition. And then, of course, what those thermostat settings are is another implication. And the deeper implication is who are we putting in office with what kind of mandates or incentives for cleaner, example, heat pumps over gas boilers, etc. So simplicity is really at the root of sustainability, and we need to think about that. Again, it ties in with gratitude, this stance of appreciation for the world around us. It's very much a theological question. We have this idea of being in a stance of simultaneous awe and fear. That's the Hebrew yirah. The midwives, the first recorded act of civil disobedience against Pharaoh in early Exodus, twice it uses this same root. They had this fear, awe of God, and as such, they had the courage to oppose the regime when the regime was doing wrong. And that is incredibly powerful. We have the idea of balance, because each of these midot or attributes are sometimes in creative tension with each other. Even the bad ones count, right? Humility is good, but ga'ava is hubris, and a certain little bit of that is called for at times. Right? We should be calm and patient most of the time, but a little bit of anger, ka'as, is important. So izun, balance, is its own value. And here's how I love watching it play out between these two particular attributes. Savlanut is patience, that we need to take the long view. And these numbers here on the screen as the biblical with a little bit of Iroquois Confederacy tossed in, right? For the 1 and 7 and 50 is the day, the week, and then the cycle of 50, as we saw in the 7-year cycle of sabbatical and the 50th year jubilee, the hard reset, right? And then how that plays out in the ordinals, these are generations. We're told in numerous places in Torah that God's concern goes to the 3rd and 4th generation. That's about a century, which is about how long carbon stays aloft from our one-time use of it. Right. So when it says that God passes down the iniquity of the parents to the children all the way to the 3rd and 4th generation, that's not a bold theological claim. That's the science. That is what is happening. 7th generation, of course, the classic notion from those who were on these lands earliest, that we need to consider the impact to the 7th generation of every decision that we make. And elsewhere in our Jewish text, that God extends chesed, loving kindness, to the 1000th generation. All of this is taking the long view, and very often we need to take the long view. But there's a little problem. Consider the fairy tale that we implicitly are always telling our children, right? Oh, and climate change just went away, woohoo, right? So we actually need the opposite sometimes of patience, which is zeal, zirizut, a sense of urgency, or again, as Dr. King taught, the fierce urgency of now. Remember how he ends the letter from a Birmingham jail basically, I apologize to any of you who think I'm being impertinent or impatient, with our people having waited centuries, right? But I appeal to God for any lack of, if I've been too patient, given those realities. So zirizut, zeal, is an example using religious language for something we can get at in all these other directions as well, of the creative balance. And we clearly need some of each. I would say right now we need zirizut until November 5th to advocate and donate and canvass at phone bank on behalf of whichever candidates we feel best demonstrate these values. But there's going to be a mixed result of some sort. Certainly nationally and in state houses, just, and of course the White House on a knife's edge. Whatever's in store for the next 2 years and 4 years and 6 years, we then need to keep cultivating the long view, the patience, along with the zeal. Okay. And in the home stretch, my three favorites, super fast: responsibility, humility, and honor. This graphic says it nicely. You know, when I got my start in this environmental ed world in the late 80s, it was pick up your litter, you'll save the earth. Then it was, we have to be a little more aggressive. We have to actually recycle it, right? And then it was reduce your carbon footprint, which we now know was exactly what the oil giants wanted us to think about, not systemic change, but personal responsibility. And then we finally got to the reality, we have to completely restructure global economic systems and maybe save a remnant. That's a wan hope, but it is hope, and it is real. And this is achrayut, responsibility. There's the famous image of spaceship Earth, the pale blue dot, etc. This beautiful teaching from Vayikra Rabbah, an ancient text, just slightly younger than the Talmud itself, attributed to second century Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. People are on a ship and someone says, I'm into individual property rights, right? I paid for passage. This seat is mine. I'm going to drill under it. And of course, everyone else says, what? The water is going to rise and flood us all. There is no such thing as owning your seat on a boat. There is no such thing as owning your plot of land on spaceship Earth and doing to it that which cannot be undone back in the direction of nature. This is the core idea of Musar from leading teacher Alan Marinas. Take responsibility. If you made a mess, clean it up, and better yet, foresee the mess that you'll make if you don't work on these virtues, and take responsibility before it happens, and then you avoid a mess altogether. That's achrayut, responsibility. Humility, anava. We looked at this before, but I want to be very particular in its eco-application. It's not just as individuals. Moses is called a most humble guy. That's why he deserved leadership. But what about as a species? What does it look like for us to say all of humanity, even those who consume and pollute the least, are still part of a species that is taking up too much space? The classic definition in Jewish ethics, musar, of humility is taking up the right amount of space, which is usually less than we are inclined to. Occasionally it's more. There's a gender angle there too. Women socialized to take up less space. Often it's helpful to give the space, seed it on people like me, so that we can hear that wider range of voices. But collectively, as humans, just think about biomass. This very alarming 2018 study in PNAS, right, the National Academy of Sciences, the impact of humanity on the biosphere. Here's all the crazy, numbers of it, but the bottom line is humans and livestock outweigh all vertebrates combined, terrestrial vertebrates combined. And here's the alarming numbers that these researchers came up with. If you go back to before modern civilization, about 100,000 years, there was an estimated 0.04 gigatons of collective terrestrial biomass, and it was all wild, right? Including a handful of early humans, wild mammals. Look at it now. Wild mammals are only 4%. The total amount has quintupled, and the vast majority of it is us and our livestock. More than all the other terrestrial critters combined, 96% to 4%. We are taking up all that space. We are taking up too much space. We need to right-size ourselves. And that requires self-contraction. There's a classic Jewish text about this, the idea of tzimtzum. God self-contracted at the beginning of creation in order to make space in which relationship could flourish. We need to do the same. Shrink our footprint, shrink our impact, and make sure that we're in it for the long haul, because again, the land is not ours. It is God's. There's an implication here also around the interreligious work, which is why I love groups like Interfaith Power and Light, that we have so much to learn with and from each other. We need to apply this ethos of humility within the human family as well. Think about America first versus and make America great again versus yay America and yay everyone else in the same breath. And I would suggest the latter is the more authentic religious direction. Lots else that I would love to focus on here, but I just wanted to end with this idea of kavod, of honor, that literally, when I relate to someone with seriousness, I honor them, because the Hebrew word for honor is the same as weight, W-E-I-G-H-T, right? Substance. If I treat someone as substantial, then I'm honoring them. If I treat them as flimsy, right, and light, then it's actually related to the opposite, the Hebrew word for curse. So we need to think about things like structural racism and our implicit biases and the mind-boggling inequities between global North and South as part of the equation of honor. Because effectively, those who are empowered politically, socially, economically are going to receive honor. They're going to make sure of it implicitly or explicitly. We need to practice proactive honoring and begin to center the voices that have too long been absent. And it all ends up with hope. If there's time, I can go into these, but to state the obvious, we need it. We have sources of it. We need to cultivate. And if there's contributions that we all can make, not only from our own faith traditions and good questions that are about to ensue, but sources of hope, that is perhaps the most important thing that we can begin to learn with and from one another. Take it away, Gail.
Great. Thanks so much, Rabbi Fred. That was really inspiring, a great overview. It was really interesting. Let me now introduce our respondent, who's going to make some comments, but also sort of dialogue a little bit with Rabbi Fred. So our respondent is Dr. Jane Ward. She's a physician. She's done clinical and academic ophthalmology and flight medicine. She is a retired U.S. Air Force colonel, and she has done during her career a master's in international studies from the University of Oklahoma. Then she moved to public health priorities of diabetes and chronic disease prevention. And then she was a founding member of the NIH Health in Buildings Roundtable. And then she discovered the discipline of lifestyle medicine based on promotion of optimum wellness by means of adoption of healthy, plant-based, whole food nutrition, physical activity, stress management, and active social participation, something we all probably could use. Please, Dr. Jane, join our discussion.
Thank you, Gail, and thank you, Rabbi Fred. This was, wow, what a tour through our religious approach to climate change. And as you said, you kind of skimmed over the scientific structure of and proof that it really is happening, but then what should we do about it from a religious perspective? And I think I mentioned to you earlier, I'm very struck with, in addition to the Judeo-Christian perhaps roots that you focus on, primarily the Judeo background, what a broad base there is among indigenous peoples for these same principles, with a little bit of a different twist in what I've been exposed to recently. And one thing, you finish on the principle of kavod, and I had picked out something from the public radio broadcasts, Living on Earth, where a South African physician was the guest. Her name was Memphela Rampeli, and she was introduced and asked about the South African principle of Ubuntu. And that's, in my mind, a very similar principle. It can be translated as I am because you are. And it reflects the principle of I cannot be well unless I ensure that you are well. And to me, it's the interconnectedness of all of us. in the Unitarian seventh principle, we say it's the respect for the interconnected web of life of which we are all a part. And this, to me, sounds a lot like some recent indigenous philosophy that I was recently exposed to. This weekend, I was at a seminar led by the Wampanoag, the Native Americans on Cape Cod, the people of the first light. And they were presenting a daily seminar called We and the Land Are One. And it was subtitled the Wampanoag Health Equity Symposium. And so it was basically implying that the only way for us to be healthy is for the entire earth to be healthy. And I think the indigenous folks have a little bit of a different twist to creation story, at least as I've heard it from some of them, where they look at humans as the youngest sibling of all of creation, not the same presentation that we get in Genesis of, God turning over creation care and stewardship to humans, but humans learning from all the other animals and plants how to be a family member, really, which I think is quite interesting. I have two favorite sources of hope for what we do next, and they're not explicitly connected to religious teaching, although one of them is the approach and the coaching given by Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, who is a climate scientist and a wonderful communicator across opinions, I think, of towards climate change. And she actually got into the field because she was raised in an evangelical family in Canada. And when she realized the inequity of the impact of climate change on the least among us getting the worst impact, that kind of set her off on her scientific career. And I think she has a very pragmatic approach, which is to listen to other people who have other opinions and then find a point of common concern and then move forward together. The other big treatise, and actually two different volumes, which you're probably also familiar with your broad background, in terms of practically speaking, what do we do? I think many of my friends that get so depressed and overwhelmed by the enormity of this challenge that they can do nothing. And I think we need to do sort of one of these everything, everywhere, all at once type things. We need to do personal actions, because that grounds us and that empowers us and convinces us that yes, something can be done. But then we need to come together as a group and change things in our community, in our state, in our country. And the guidebook that I like for that are the two collections edited by Paul Hawken. One was Drawdown, which is basically, this isn't hopeless. There are already, in the first volume, 100 good practices around the world that if they were scaled up, could help us to not only slow climate change, but reverse it. And the other book was Regeneration, which is just the newer, few years more updated version of that. But they include things that you alluded to in your last graph there, where you show the weight of biomass of wild animals before human civilization, and then our livestock, and then humans. So one of my personal choices, and I think it's not only healthiest for the planet, but healthiest for us, is I don't eat animal products. So I'd be interested in your comments back on this idea of some of the indigenous beliefs, and are they more of a communal approach to to our existence, or are they more humble than the Western approach? I'm interested in your response to what I just said.
Amen to all of it, and thank you. Starting with the last point, I think it's important not to oversimplify or to romanticize Native traditions, right? They absolutely changed the landscape. What is key is they always did so at a smaller pre-industrial scale, and they were focused on, sometimes intentionally and sometimes incidentally, given the available technology and the realities of pressures of competing tribes, et cetera, that they would retain that relatively small scale approach. So the classic idea is, you're walking, you should never take more than a certain percentage of the leaves or flowers of something, right? Similarly, when you see a herd, right? Buffalo killing was very sustainable for Plains Native Americans for centuries, and the buffalo herd would recover, right? But then when white settlers had different priorities and wanted to fence out the land and put this private property notion in, we almost extirpated this linchpin species of the central U.S. So it's about that small scale, similar to what I was saying about the sabbatical year teaching in Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy. We have that too. We just never put it into practice. That we need to think in ongoing sustainable cycles. What if every 7th year we had to do things very differently? We would live closer to the land. We would look a lot more like the Wampanoag or the Nacotchtank, here, or the many sacred lands that we're on, that were stewarded for so long by people whose wisdom we still need to learn. I pulled this up as you were speaking. It's just funny. I had the slide of earlier today, all the DC-based faith advocates speaking, and the part that I happened to be given to say in front of the entire State Department delegation heading to COP in a couple days, in a kind of call and response. The response was, empower us to be stewards of all creation. And my little piece was, we give thanks for the wisdom of indigenous peoples, whose sacred knowledge of the land, waters, and skies is a gift to all of humanity, ancient wisdom in balance with the earth. May we honor their leadership, heed their calls for justice, and walk in reverence for the world that sustains us all. Empower us to be stewards of all creation. So yes, amen. We need to keep learning with and from each other, and we need to center those voices who have too long been left out. Kudos to this administration. The last 4 years has seen more progress for Native peoples and their legal standing, and the consideration of bringing Native wisdom into land stewarding, even at the level of policy, than way further than we've ever gotten. But now we need that at an even higher level, and we need it in the international arena. What are we doing to the low-lying Pacific Islands and those Native cultures with sea level rise? So we must heed them.
Well, thanks. I really like that. And I think part of this idea of we are the land that I was attracted to about this event I went to on Saturday is, I have this vision as a physician, and especially getting through this pandemic. It's almost as if to me, it's a useful image to think of us as one organism, not just being kind to, love thy neighbor, but it's almost like you cannot separate any of us. What I breathe out, my neighbor breathes in, whether my neighbor is my human neighbor or my tree. Thankfully, the trees are really doing a good job helping us fight climate change, but we are almost one organism. And so when we approach things like universal health care, to me, it's just such an obvious Yes, we have to do that because that's the health of all of us. We're almost all like one organism. And so anyway, I don't know where that particular image fits in, but it seems to me to be enveloped in a lot of this discussion. So thank you so
Super.
much. Phil.
Oh, thank you. Super fast, because I know Gail has great
There
input
are
from
some
the
questions.
community.
Yeah, I'd like
I-
to turn to questions, but I want to thank you both. It was delightful discussion, and it was a great presentation. Let me turn to some of the questions now. There's a person who asked, "Thank you, Rabbi Fred, for inspiring me even more to look at the Torah." Jane just spoke about not eating meat. Sounds like you're advocating every seventh year resting. What are other individual decisions that you think send the message of humility and the importance of being in right relationship with the earth?
Oh, a beautiful question. You know, for decades, there's been books like 100 Things You Can Do to Save the Earth. There are websites. There's Ask Umbra and Ask, the Sierra has its version. There's all these wonderful secular, and secular can still be holy, right? So we need to heed the science and the people who think about this the most. Project Drawdown is a great example of where we should be putting our collective energy most strategically. So, if you are stuck with the car that you're with, see how much you can trip chain, make sure the tires are fully inflated, right? Little things like that, right? I mean, minor, but then move toward EV or at least hybrid if you haven't yet done so when it's time to replace, and think about how many cars are needed, etc. Right? I would say this even if it wasn't 2 weeks before a really consequential election, but a place for this ethos of sacrifice, right? Sacrifice is from the word sacred. It means I'm giving something up, but I'm really making a bargain. I'm getting something better in return, something holy. So I hope we all sacrifice our time, sacrifice some of our discretionary income, etc., in order to help move the needle in the ways that we can to get the people elected, because only every 4 years do we have this level of opportunity. Every day we have an opportunity for our own footprint. But here we actually are all small weights on a giant lever, but put enough of us together and think Archimedes, right? We can move the earth with that lever. So that would be the single most important personal action that I would say in the next 2 weeks is civic engagement.
Let me move on to the next question. How do we deal with our global society in which economics trumps the ethical environment laws you cited?
Economics is literally the numbers of the house. That's what right? Eco and nomos, right? Ecology is the study of the house. You have to understand it before you can crunch numbers within it, right? So economy is a subset of ecology, as much as there's a certain hubris in the marketplace that would like to have some rough synonym between God and market. It is not thus. Adam Smith never envisioned it that way, right? So this isn't just about undoing the excesses of modern capitalism. It's about returning to the core of the ultimately, not to, it's a Marx phrase, but the means of production ultimately is the earth, right? The old joke of, in economics terms, invest in real estate. They're not making any more of it, right? Well, that's the reality. If anything, we're making less of it because we are polluting parts of it and stripping it of its natural features beyond reclaim. And so we need to recenter and simply restore the primacy of ecology over and across economy. That's work we all have to do together. There's no one magic elixir for it, but there's nothing more important than that.
Great, thank you. Another question that seems like it's more about explaining something that was confusing. Thank you so much. Can you please explain about the oil lamp? I didn't follow that.
Okay, thank you. So following this law of thou shalt not waste, the rabbis drill down. This is the classic rabbinic model that it's easy to make fun of, and I do all the time, right? Of like further hair splitting. What does this mean? And well, if so, then, right? So they're asking, what does it actually mean if do not waste applies to everything? Say I have an oil lamp. That was the technology of the day, like candles, right? They burned oil, most commonly either olive oil as a direct agricultural byproduct, or naphtha, which was an early version of the equivalent of digging for oil. And the reality is they combust differently. They need different amounts of oxygen to be let in order to burn optimally. So if you want to let that oil last as long as possible, get as many lumens as possible for as many hours from a fixed quantity of a finite substance that came to you at some marginal environmental cost, then you need to focus on what it is and how it works. There's no such thing as an excuse of, I don't know how a transmission or a carburetor works, so I'm just going to drive the car and yeah, I'll do jackrabbit starts and let all that momentum be wasted in the form of braking. Those are not options from a religious standpoint. We need to understand the engineering side. Right? If this is science, this is, in the larger STEM world, we need to understand how things work so that we can make them work as efficiently as possible. And if not, we are breaking religious rules. I think that's a powerful teaching.
Great, thank you. This is a question from a scientist who's been involved with climate science since the late 80s. I've been involved in a few conflicts, both with anti-science skeptics and with the oversell of our understanding. I've noticed we often train our students to box and then send them out into a street fight. How does one employ the ideas you presented when we find ourselves in a street fight of misinformation and cruel retaliation?
Kudos. That is so beautifully worded and asked, and I thank you for whoever that is for the work that you've been doing all these years. This is where we get into the nuances of climate communication, which, as I'm sure you know, is a burgeoning field. So I'm a big fan of the YPCCC, that's the Yale Program on Climate Change Communications. Here in our area, George Mason University is a leader in that field, right across the river from me in Northern Virginia. There's a group called Eco-America that is popularizing a lot of this. And there's wonderful research out there at the intersection of psychology and marketing and focus groups together with climate science to figure out what actually works. And the wisdom keeps changing, right? At one point, global warming was the right phrase, and then it was the wrong one. And climate change was initially the cold version, and then it became the preferred, and now it's seeming passé, right? So there's incredible advice out there about how to talk about this. Catherine Hayhoe, as Jane mentioned, is a great exemplar of this. So I think it behooves us all to go to those sites like Yale and George Mason Climate Change Communications, learn a little bit of the latest research, watch some of the people who know this best doing it, and note the ways in which it's less about the science, because facts are important, but they're not, if the facts alone were determinative of people's actions, we would have moved the needle already. We need to touch people's hearts, and we need to do that despite the skepticism of the implicit biases that we bring to these conversations. So in the analogy of the street fight, right, we need to be the smarter people who understand the strategy at play, so that even if we don't make as much noise, we're not carrying the weapons that they are, but we wield the greatest tool of all, which is the focused application of knowledge. And then the pen will be mightier than the sword.
Great, thank you. Another question. Project Drawdown that you mentioned is a great example of addressing climate change. Do you have any suggestions for how to address the biodiversity crisis you also emphasized?
Hmm. So they are clearly hand in hand, but we need to treat biodiversity on its own. There are causes of the alarming collapse that are not directly climate related, of course, and it has to do in large measure with humans taking up too much space. So this is where the shrinking of consumption needs to come into play. It's different items, right? We need to use less energy and source more of it sustainably, also quickly, all of it, from a climate standpoint. So we need to draw that down. But we also need to think about the origin of the foods that we eat and the toilet paper that we purchase for our bathrooms and everything else about quotidian life and consider their impact. And it initially falls on the educated, affluent consumer to pay the margin of difference for fair trade, organic, shade grown coffee, etc., right? Over the horrible stuff that most people drink most of the time. But ultimately, we need to develop that. But we also need to change the norms across industries, across practices, across governments. And again, that's where these periodic moments to move the needle in regulatory directions are critical. The ultimate implication for biodiversity of who wins the US presidential election 2 weeks from now, right, is the single most consequential thing. The next most consequential thing is eating lower on the food chain because, right, our meat consumption is indeed squeezing out a lot of the space in Costa Rican cloud forest and the what's left of the Brazilian Amazon, etc., to satisfy wealthy northern tastes for more and more meat. And that's not cool.
Okay, so I've got one last question. I'm currently reading To Speak for the Trees, where the focus, simply stated, is to preserve and expand our arboreal forests. The focus emphasizes the interconnectedness of all of nature, which of course we are part of. Maybe we need to start with something so simple like trees, where people could begin and then move on to more lofty efforts. What do you think of that idea?
So a reminder that the law of not wasting, which is kind of the root of a Jewish environmental ethic, it started with about trees, right? Trees as non-combatants, which is to say they are so important that all of the horrible, awful news of the day pales in comparison to the question of these giants, which live many human lifetimes. And on which our yet unborn descendants will depend. They will depend on it for regulation of the climate and for erosion control and for habitat provision and for shade and microclimate. And we all know, right, those list of ways in which they're so needed. So absolutely. But trees are kind of like the charismatic megafauna of flora, right? You've probably heard this phrase, charismatic megafauna. It's very easy to get all excited about the occasional, the endangered polar bear. Research actually shows that that's not going to move most people on climate, however heartrending those issues are, because polar bears are distant and vicious. And right, so we can't only go for the charismatic mega. We also need to go for the micro, and that's the phytoplankton, and that's the everything that is at the base of a food web and this interconnected web of creation. When I had a quick slide on gratitude, and my ultimate example of gratitude is photosynthesis, right? We take for granted this thing without which none of us would be here. And so what does it mean to tune into that and appreciate it and just celebrate it for a while, bring that into ourselves, and then think about how can the gifts that photosynthesis enables be equitably spread out across space and across time. And if we do that, we introduce the intergenerational solidarity. That's Pope Francis's term in Laudato Si for this idea of Lador Vador, from generation to generation.
Very good. Thank you, Rabbi Fred. Thank you, Dr. Jane. What a wonderful evening. Great discussion. You both did a remarkable job here.